Mary Fisher, and today I have the honor to interview my good friend Mort Crim, an international news journalist who's worked alongside Paul Harvey, Walter Cronkite, and Ted Koppel. He spent his lifetime interviewing the world's most interesting people and was the inspiration behind the Will Ferrell parody in the movie Anchorman. Mort has authored many books, but has published his fascinating memoir, Anchorman, A Journalist's Search for Truth. Ted Koppel, former anchor of ABC Newsline, notes, "I've known Mort for more than 50 years, or I thought I did. But oh, what a rambunctious, emotional, ethical, and intellectual food fight has been going on behind that button-down facade." While he spent his professional lifetime focusing on the most interesting people in a fascinating world, he's done an extraordinary job of concealing one of the most interesting stories of all, his own, until now. Read on. Mort, from teenage evangelist to international journalist, what compelled you to seek this new profession?
Well, I grew up in a very religious home. My father was a pastor. His twin brother was an evangelist. My aunt was a medical missionary. I had two brothers-in-law who were clergy. And it was as common for me to play preacher when I was 5 years old as it would have been most kids to play cops and robbers. Growing up in that kind of an environment, I reached a point where I began to question a lot of the things that had been taken as certainties in my environment, in our church, and in our home. And I began to have questions about the Bible, about what I'd been taught about God, about Jesus, about all of these things that were a part of traditional, fundamental Christianity. I started out to follow my dad into the pulpit, and that just wasn't going to work for me. It didn't work for me because I would have been a hypocrite to stand up and preach from the pulpit things that I had questions about, or in some cases just didn't believe. Journalism seemed like the logical profession because, in theory at least, journalists are committed to finding facts, looking for truth, trying to tell it like it is without regard to what sacred cows they're going to slay along the way. So journalism just felt like a good fit. It's also an exciting profession where I could have a front row seat, as I like to call it, to the greatest show on earth, the human drama, and get paid for doing it. So the book, A Journalist's Search for Truth, subtitled A Journalist's Search for Truth, the book is Anchored, really follows me along that path of two tracks. Number one, professionally as a journalist, but then there's that subtext of always looking for that greater truth, that cosmic truth. In every story, I was looking for the who, what, when, where, and why of the story. But in my personal spiritual search, I was more obsessed with the why. Why are we here? What's it all about? Is there any meaning to life other than what we just put into it through our own imaginations and our own willingness to try to make sense out of life? And that search has been fascinating, and it's been productive. It led me not to find all the answers, but it did teach me how to ask the right questions. I'm still on the journey. I consider myself a person of faith, but it's not the interpretation of the faith that I grew up with. Rather, it is an examination of that faith and asking the hard questions and coming to terms with what I now see as a life that does have meaning and does have purpose. And I do believe in God, that God is love. The Bible says God is love. And I think we've messed up an awful lot of minds and made faith very difficult for an awful lot of people by overcomplicating that very simple statement that God is love, and that's the God that I worship.
Thank you. In your career, you've interviewed many celebrities, from Bill Gates to Ronald Reagan, from Larry King to Jerry Lewis, from Chuck Yeager to Jay Leno. You've even worked with Walter Cronkite and Paul Harvey. Do you have any interesting stories to share with us?
Oh, a ton of them, and many of them are in this book. If you want one particular story that comes to mind, it was when I had lunch at the White House with Ronald Reagan. That sounds like name dropping, but actually it's the role of the journalist to interview these people, and I had the good pleasure of covering many presidents several summit conferences, and in the case of Lyndon Johnson, I was with ABC at the time, and I covered him on several international trips, including a very long trip through Asia, and it ended with a visit to Vietnam during the war. But the one that stands out in my mind is having lunch at the White House with Ronald Reagan. He had invited, or the White House had invited, reporters, anchors, and some newspaper editors from around the country. I think there were about 25 of us in total. And the gentleman who was in charge of the seating arrangements at this White House luncheon happened to have graduated from Anderson College. And he recognized my name on the list, and so he placed me right next to President Reagan, which gave me an opportunity to talk to him in ways that the rest of the press corps had a chance to ask a question during the news conference, but I got to have an entire lunchtime conversation with him. He was absolutely enthralled by his time in the movies. He loved being an actor, and that's what he wanted to talk about during the luncheon. Of course, I had a list of questions as a journalist that I wanted to ask him about the economy, about the automobile industry, which I knew was of interest to our Detroit audience, and education, a lot of other things, taxes. But he kept bringing the conversation back to actors that he had worked with in Hollywood, movies he had made, producers he had known. I managed to get my questions in and get the answers I wanted, but toward the end of the luncheon, I turned to him and I said, "Mr. President, do you ever miss acting?" And in that familiar Reagan voice, he said, "Why, Mort, this is the greatest role I've ever played." And I think in that moment I understood why people who didn't care for Reagan, didn't like his policies, weren't conservatives, why they liked the man, because he was that enthusiastic about life. Whatever role he played, he'd been president of the Screen Actors Guild, he'd been governor of California, now he was president of the United States, and in every role, it was the greatest role he ever played because he was enthusiastic and positive about life.
Very interesting. How did you find out that you were the inspiration for the movie Anchorman with Will Ferrell?
I don't know if inspiration is a good word. It is interesting because my life, career, philosophy, and approach to things was so totally opposite that of Ron Burgundy, the anti-hero in the Anchorman movies. But Will Ferrell, in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine shortly after Anchorman 2 came out, was asked how they got the idea for the movie, and he said Mort Crim and Jessica Savage, when they were co-anchoring in Philadelphia. Come to find out, he had watched a documentary after Jessica's tragic death on the Lifetime channel, in which I had been extensively interviewed. And the way he told it to Rolling Stone, he said there was this Anchorman, Mort Crim, and he still used his Anchorman voice, and he parodied it. And he brought the idea up then for doing a movie about an Anchorman, a comedy, to Adam Mackey, who was his partner and co-producer, and actually Adam wrote the script. Adam said, "Well, I know Mort Crim." He said, "I grew up in Philadelphia." And he said, "I watched Mort and Jessica." So he went back and dug up some old videotapes from the KYW archives, and he and Will sat down and watched Jessica and me performing as an anchor couple. And from that got the idea of doing a parody or a comedy, satire. I met Will Ferrell. His office invited Renee and me to the premiere of Anchorman 2 in New York. There was an after party, and at the party I met Will. And he shook my hand and he said, "I want to thank you for the way you've handled all this in good humor." I think he might have been surprised that a serious anchorman was having himself parodied in such a way. And I said, "Well, Will, if you had billed this movie as a documentary, I'd really be pissed. But," I said, "as a satire," I said, "I love Ted Knight on the Mary Tyler Moore Show." I said, "We've got to be able to laugh at ourselves and our foibles and our profession." And I said, "I thought as a comedy, as a parody, you did a good job."
In the movie, Ron Burgundy balks at the idea of a female co-anchor. When you worked in Philadelphia, the station brought in the first female anchor, Jessica Savage. What was she really like?
She was a great person and an excellent reporter. Uh, my initial uh, my initial reticence or hesitancy to want to share the anchor desk with her was probably, as I look back on it, pure ego. I mean, I had worked with women. I was currently doing the noon news with Marcia Rose Shestak. Um, we had women operating cameras. We had women working in various roles in the newsroom. Didn't have any anchors other than for the noon, but no primetime anchors in the evening news. And I look back on it and I think it was pure arrogance. It was pure ego. It wasn't chauvinism. It wasn't that she was a girl or a woman. She was pretty much a girl. She was pretty young at that time. But it was just that I didn't feel any need. Our ratings were doing well, and I didn't see any need to have a co-anchor, male or female, at that time. And so after she was put on the anchor, she was 24, I believe, 24 years old. I was 37, maybe, and considered myself experienced. I had a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern. I had been at the network for 5 years. I was pretty hot stuff, and I didn't need anybody sitting there taking up some of my airtime. Hate to admit that, but that's really what it was. As I got to know Jessica and began to respect her as not only a good anchor, but a really hard-working reporter who had developed her chops in Houston and really had been a working reporter before she got to Philadelphia. So it worked out.
Mort, what do you hope that people will get from this book?
This book? Well, you know, it started out to be a chronicle of a career. I've had an interesting career, but then so have a lot of journalists. And you know, what qualifies me, or why should my story be any more interesting than anybody else's? So I think part of that, I believe everybody has a story. I really do believe that everybody has a story that could be compelling and interesting because human beings are infinitely fascinating. Not everybody has the writing skills, or the time, or the willingness, or the courage to reveal themselves, and it does take some of that. So, what distinguishes this book? Why this book from any other book that is just a series of stories about an interesting life? I'll give you a little anecdote that maybe puts that into perspective. It took me 3 years to get my life story, the parts of it that I felt were relevant, into a computer, ready to send to a publisher. So I sent it to my agent in New York, Susanna Einstein. She owns Einstein Literary, a very good agency. And Susanna read the book, read the manuscript, got back to me, and she said, "It's a good book." She said, it's a good page turner, interesting stories. I really enjoyed it. She said, "You know I'm Jewish." And I said, "Sure, I know you're Jewish." She said, "Well, I never thought I would ever be saying this to anybody, but I'm going to say it to you. You need more Jesus in your book." That kind of took me back a little bit, because I did recognize that in writing this book, even though I was telling the story of a journalism career, little bits of my personal struggles with faith just kept popping up. Things that had happened to me as a child, things that I had believed that I was now challenging, and sort of the evolution of my faith, it kept popping up. And what she was telling me was, your book needs more of that. So I thought, okay, I understand. You're saying get more of the spiritual struggle in there. That's what people want to read about, and that's where you can be uniquely helpful. So I went back and tried to interject more of that into the book, and it just didn't work. It ended up being a patch quilt. So I virtually had to go back and rewrite the book from the beginning, although I included a lot of the stuff that I'd already written. It wasn't like reinventing the wheel. A lot of the stories that I had used about my career were retained, but the theme, the thrust, the direction, the subtext of the book became completely different when I started to write it from the perspective of somebody who began in certainty religiously and traded that certainty for absolute honesty and what that entailed and where that took me in the journey. So I guess what I would want people to get from this book is that no matter where you start in life, no matter what faith perspective you have in life, or no faith perspective, if you will question, if you will open yourself up to honestly look at things from a reasonable, rational, logical standpoint, and be willing to face truth, no matter how it conflicts, and that this is true politically too, no matter how it conflicts with your preconceptions of what you thought you believed, there is hope for you to develop a theology, a philosophy, a political viewpoint that is based on facts. Now, having said that, I recognize that faith carries us beyond what we can know rationally. Otherwise, faith would have no meaning. The word would have no meaning if we just could reason ourselves to everything. And the way I illustrate that, I've already told you, I believe God is love. I think love is the most powerful force. I think it is the universe's creative force. I did not fall in love with my wife through logic, through reason. I didn't sit down with a yellow pad and draw a line and say, these are her good points, these are her negative points, and come to some logical conclusion. Okay, now I'm in love with her. Went beyond that, transcended that. There are some logical, practical things that I can say about my wife and she can say about me, but our love transcends the purely rational and logical. Can't explain it. It's a relationship. My relationship with God cannot be explained. God cannot be explained. And I think it's a fool's errand to go about trying to rationalize or find God through logic. I tried through all the books. I went to school. I went to theological school. I tried and I finally discovered the only way I can know God is through my relationships with people, because God is love, and that's where we experience love.
Beautifully said. The book can be purchased at mortcrimspeaks.com. Thank you for your friendship, and thank you for this impromptu interview.
And thank you for the beautiful cover that you and your company produced for this book.
Thank you, Mort.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was super fun.